My name is Isabella Yazzie, but those who know me call me Izzy. I have been working as a park ranger for the National Park Service for over 10 years, and for the past 7 years I have been stationed at Death Valley National Park in California. This is a place of extremes. It is the driest, lowest, and hottest point in North America. Many people think the danger here comes from the heat, the isolation, or getting lost in 3 or 4 million acres of desert wilderness. They're all wrong. The real danger moves at night, leaves tracks in the ancient lake bed, and knows exactly where every person who has gone missing since 1849 is buried. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also, share your thoughts on the story in the comments. Your opinions are very valuable to us. The sailing stones of Racetrack Playa have been a mystery for decades. These stones, some weighing up to 700 pounds, move across the flat desert surface, leaving behind tracks hundreds of feet long. Scientists claim to have solved this mystery. Wind, ice, and rare winter rains create the perfect conditions for the rocks to slide. They've published articles, shown time-lapse videos, and announced that the mystery has been solved. They're only seeing what the rocks want them to see. I first noticed something was wrong in March 2023. It was my routine patrol of Racetrack Playa, a dry lake bed in the northern part of the park that looks like cracked pottery stretched to the horizon. The sailing stones were in their usual positions, or so I thought, until I checked my GPS records from the previous month. Stone designation RS7, a 600-pound dolomite boulder, had moved 347 feet. Nothing unusual there, except it had moved in a perfect spiral pattern, and at the center of that spiral my metal detector went crazy. 3 feet down, we found them. Erica and Helmut Fischer, the Death Valley Germans who'd gone missing in 1996. They'd been the subject of one of the park's most extensive search operations, their disappearance spawning countless theories and amateur investigations. Their rental van had been found at the bottom of Anvil Canyon, but their bodies were never recovered. Until the rock led me to them. They were perfectly preserved, mummified by the desert heat and mineral-rich soil. But that wasn't the strangest part. They were holding hands, and clutched between them was a notebook, the pages filled with numbers. GPS coordinates, dozens of them, and a message in shaky handwriting. Die Steine wissen es. Sie haben es uns gezeigt. The stones know. They showed us. I should have reported it immediately, followed protocol, called in the FBI. Instead, I pocketed the notebook and told my supervisor we'd found the Germans, but no unusual circumstances. Something in my grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. Stories she'd told me about this desert when she worked the uranium mines in the 1950s. The rocks aren't just rocks, mija, she'd said in her mix of Navajo and Spanish. They're messengers. They carry the memory of everyone who's died here, and sometimes, when the conditions are right, they show you where the earth has swallowed them. I'd dismissed it as reservation folklore mixed with radiation-induced delusions from her mining days. Now, holding that notebook, I wasn't so sure. That night, I returned to Racetrack Playa alone. It's strictly forbidden. Solo patrol in Death Valley at night is a termination offense. But I had to know. I set up my equipment: time-lapse cameras, motion sensors, electromagnetic field detectors I'd borrowed from a paranormal investigator friend who owed me a favor, and most importantly, a drone with thermal imaging. At 2:47 a.m., the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute. My breath became visible, which should be impossible in Death Valley even in March. Then I heard it, a sound like grinding stone, but rhythmic, almost musical. Through my night vision goggles I watched as 13 stones began to move simultaneously. They weren't sliding. They weren't being pushed by wind or ice. They were lifting slightly off the ground, rotating, and setting back down a few inches forward. The movement was deliberate, intelligent. They were writing something in the earth. I launched the drone, sending it up for an aerial view. What I saw on the monitor made my hands shake. The stones were creating a map. Not just any map. They were marking every GPS coordinate from the German couple's notebook and adding new ones, dozens of new ones. I followed the nearest coordinate, my boots crunching on the ancient lake bed that hadn't seen water in thousands of years. 34 degrees, 55 minutes, 23.7 seconds north, 116 degrees, 49 minutes, 41.3 seconds west. The spot looked unremarkable, just more cracked earth and scattered rocks. But when I swept my metal detector over it, the reading spiked. 6 feet down, I found him, a prospector from 1873 based on the coins in his pocket. But he was holding something that shouldn't exist, a digital camera from 2019. The memory card was somehow intact, protected in what looked like a naturally formed crystal shell. The last photo, date-stamped October 13, 2019, showed 4 college students standing at Zabriskie Point. I recognized them immediately. They'd gone missing that same day, their car found at Badwater Basin, 20 miles from where they'd last been seen. The rocks had marked their location, too. I found them before dawn, buried in a formation that defied geology. Their bodies were encased in salt crystals that had grown in perfect geometric patterns, like some kind of natural sarcophagus. They'd only been dead for 4 years, but the mineralization suggested centuries. But the most disturbing discovery was what I found in the first student's backpack, a journal entry dated October 15, 2019, 2 days after they'd died. The rocks showed us the way. We followed their trails backward, like the ranger's grandmother said. We found the underground river, the one that connects all the burial sites. The Shoshone were right. Death Valley isn't just a place where people die. It's a place that collects death, catalogs it, preserves it. The rocks are like librarians, marking where each story ends. But something else moves them. Something that needs the dead to be found in a specific order. We're part of the pattern now. Whoever finds this, follow the spiral. The center isn't empty, it's full. 1,849 is the key. The year of the lost 49ers, the wagon train that gave Death Valley its name. According to history, only one person died, a man named Fish. But my grandmother had told me different stories passed down from the Shoshone who watched from the mountains. Hundreds died, she said, swallowed by the valley in places that shouldn't exist. I spent the next 3 weeks following the rock trails, documenting everything. The patterns were consistent. Each stone's movement corresponded to a death, and the trails always led to bodies. Some were recent, hikers who'd vanished in the last few years. Others were ancient, indigenous remains that predated European contact. But all of them were positioned deliberately, arranged in a vast geometric pattern across the valley floor. The most concentrated area was near Furnace Creek, where the temperature had hit 134 degrees Fahrenheit in 2021, the hottest reliably recorded temperature on Earth. The rocks here moved differently, faster, more purposefully. Their trails formed symbols I recognized from my grandmother's sketches. Not Navajo or Shoshone, but something older. I contacted Dr. Ellie Vermont, a quantum physicist at Caltech who'd written papers on impossible mineralogical phenomena in Death Valley. She thought I was joking when I first called, but the photos convinced her to drive out. What she discovered changed everything. The rocks aren't moving through space, she told me, her hands shaking as she reviewed her readings. They're moving through space-time. The extreme conditions here, the heat, the below sea level pressure, the mineral composition, they've created what I can only describe as a temporal anomaly. The rocks exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. When they move, they're actually maintaining their position while time flows around them differently. So they're not marking where bodies are, I said. They're marking where bodies will be? Both. Neither. All simultaneously. She pulled up a 3D model on her laptop. Look at this. If we map every position these rocks have occupied based on their trails, and we add the time dimension, they're creating a four-dimensional structure. A pattern that extends not just across space, but through time. What kind of pattern? She was quiet for a long moment. Have you ever heard of the Barker Ranch? My blood ran cold. Barker Ranch was where the Manson family hid out in 1969, in the Panamint Range on the western edge of Death Valley. Charlie Manson was convinced there was an underground city beneath the desert, a place he called the Hole, where he and his followers could hide during the race war he was trying to start. The geology surveys from the 1960s were classified, Ellie continued. But I have a contact at China Lake who shared some declassified portions. There's definitely something under Death Valley, not a city, but a natural formation that shouldn't exist. Caverns that maintain a constant temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit, even when it's 130 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface. And get this, the magnetic anomalies in those caverns match the positions where your rocks stop moving. I knew where we had to go next. The spiral pattern the rocks had been creating all led to one central point. 36 degrees, 30 minutes, 14.5 seconds north, 117 degrees, 5 minutes, 45.8 seconds west. According to my GPS, it was an unremarkable spot in the middle of the Mesquite Flat sand dunes. But according to the Death Valley German's notebook, it was something else entirely. The last entry, in Erika Fischer's handwriting, simply said, Der Eingang zur Sammlung, the entrance to the collection. We arrived at the coordinates just before sunset. The sand here was different, finer, almost crystalline, and it hummed with a frequency you could feel in your bones. Ellie's equipment went haywire, detecting particles that shouldn't exist, electromagnetic readings that defied physics. That's when we saw them. Not just moving rocks, but dozens of them, converging on our location from all directions. They moved in daylight, in full view, sliding through the sand as if it were water. They formed a perfect circle around us, and in the center, the sand began to spiral downward, creating a vortex that revealed something underneath. Metal. Ancient, corroded metal with symbols that looked both indigenous and impossibly advanced. It was a hatch of some kind, partially buried, probably hidden for centuries until the rocks decided to reveal it. We should call this in, Ellie said, but she was already pulling out her tools, unable to resist the mystery. We should, I agreed, but I was already turning the wheel lock mechanism that shouldn't have existed in Death Valley, that shouldn't have existed in 1849, that shouldn't have existed at all. The hatch opened with a pressurized hiss, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The air that rushed out was cool, 72 degrees Fahrenheit exactly, and it carried a smell like ozone and something else, something organic and ancient. I looked at Ellie, then at the rocks surrounding us. They'd stopped moving, waiting, as if they'd fulfilled their purpose by bringing us here. In the distance, I could see more rocks approaching, their trails converging on this spot. Whatever was down there, whatever the rocks had been marking, we were about to discover why Death Valley had been collecting bodies for over 150 years. My grandmother was right, I whispered, testing the ladder's stability. The rocks are messengers. But the question is, who are they delivering us to? The ladder descended for exactly 134 rungs. I counted each one, remembering that 134 was the temperature record at Furnace Creek. Like everything in Death Valley, even this depth had meaning. The walls transitioned from natural sandstone to something else, a material that looked like volcanic glass but felt warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat. Ellie followed close behind, her equipment bag scraping against the narrow shaft. Izzy, the electromagnetic readings down here, they're off the charts. This shouldn't be possible. We're detecting chronoton particles. English, Doc, I said, though my flashlight was revealing things that made scientific impossibility seem quaint. Theoretical particles that only exist during time displacement. Either someone's running the world's most advanced physics experiment under Death Valley, or time moves differently down here, I finished, remembering the journal entry from 2019, dated 2 days after the students had died. The latter ended in a chamber that defied explanation. It was vast. Our lights couldn't find the far walls, and filled with crystalline structures that grew from floor to ceiling like a frozen forest of glass. But it was what was inside the crystals that made us both stop breathing. Bodies. Hundreds of them, each perfectly preserved in translucent mineral cocoons, arranged in concentric circles around a central platform. The nearest one made my knees weak. It was one of the lost 49ers, still wearing the remnants of 1849 pioneer clothing. But his eyes were open, tracking our movement. "He's alive," Ellie whispered, her voice echoing in the crystalline chamber. "That's impossible. He'd be over 200 years old." I approached the crystal, my hand trembling as I touched its surface. It was warm, and I could feel a pulse, not the man's heartbeat, but something else. The crystal itself was alive. And then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. "Ayúdame. Help me." But his lips hadn't moved. "The crystals," Ellie said, running her scanner over the formation. "They're not minerals, they're organized energy structures. They're preserving these people in a state of quantum superposition, neither alive nor dead, existing between moments." "Can we free them?" Before Ellie could answer, we heard footsteps, not from above, but from deeper in the cavern. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. I drew my service weapon, pushing Ellie behind a crystal formation. "Lower your weapon, Ranger Yazzie." The voice was familiar, but wrong. Out of the shadows stepped Supervisory Ranger Tom Morrison, my boss. Except Tom was supposed to be in Barstow at a budget meeting, and his eyes were reflecting light like a nocturnal animal's. Behind him were 6 others, all park employees I recognized, all with those same reflective eyes. They moved in perfect synchronization, like they were sharing a single consciousness. "Tom," I kept my weapon raised. "What the hell is this?" "This is the collection," he said, gesturing to the crystallized bodies. "Death Valley has been gathering them since long before humans named it. The Shoshone called it Timbisha, rock paint. They understood. The valley doesn't just collect death. It preserves it, studies it, learns from it." "Learns?" "The valley is a geological formation, not originally, no." Tom's smile was wrong, too wide. "But in 1945 something changed. You know about the Manhattan Project, the atomic tests in Nevada. What you don't know is that one test went wrong. Instead of splitting atoms, they split something else. They cracked open a dimensional barrier, and something came through, something that merged with the valley itself." Ellie stepped out from behind the crystal, her scanner aimed at Tom. "You're not human anymore. Your cellular structure. It's part mineral." "We're evolved," Tom corrected. "The entity that merged with Death Valley. It doesn't destroy. It preserves, catalogs, integrates. Every person who dies here becomes part of its consciousness, and some of us, the lucky ones, get to maintain our individuality while serving its purpose, which is to prepare. The dimensional crack is widening. The rocks have been marking positions, yes, but not just of bodies. They're marking weak points where our reality touches others. The collection isn't random. These are people who've glimpsed other dimensions, who've seen through the veil. They're preserved here because when the convergence happens, we'll need their unique perspectives to navigate what's coming. I thought about the German couple's notebook, the GPS coordinates, the message about the stones showing them something. The Death Valley Germans. They found this place in 1996 and chose to join the collection willingly, Tom confirmed. They understood what isolation in the desert had shown them, that Death Valley is a conscious entity now, one that's trying to prevent our reality from collapsing when the dimensional barriers fail completely. So, you're what? Recruiting? I couldn't hide my disgust. Preserving. Every person in these crystals is conscious, experiencing all possible timelines simultaneously. They're not trapped, they're expanded. Living every life they could have lived, seeing every choice they could have made. Tom approached the nearest crystal, placing his hand on it. This prospector from 1873, he's simultaneously finding gold, dying of thirst, living to old age, and discovering the underground rivers. All versions of his life are equally real to him now. Ellie's equipment started beeping frantically. There's a massive energy surge coming from below. Something's rising. The floor began to vibrate and the crystals resonated with a harmonic frequency that made my teeth ache. From the central platform, something emerged. Not solid, not liquid, but something in between. It took a vaguely humanoid shape, composed of what looked like living sand and fragments of every rock type in Death Valley. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through canyons, water over stone, and the crack of earth under extreme heat. Ranger Isabella Yazzie. Your bloodline carries the memory. My grandmother's stories flooded back, not just stories but genetic memories passed down through generations. The uranium miners in the 1950s hadn't just found radioactive ore. They'd found evidence of this entity, these preservation chambers. Some had joined willingly. Others, like my grandmother, had fled with knowledge that manifested as folklore. My grandmother knew about you, I said. She was offered the same choice you're being offered now. Join the collection. Help prepare humanity for the convergence. Or leave, knowing that the sailing stones will eventually mark your position anyway. Death Valley doesn't lose track of anyone who's learned its secret. There's a third option, Ellie interrupted, surprising everyone. She held up her scanner, showing readings I didn't understand. The dimensional barrier isn't failing naturally. It's being deliberately weakened. Someone or something is trying to force the convergence. The entity's form shifted, showing what might have been surprise. Explain. The rock's movements, the patterns they create, they're not just marking positions. They're responding to external manipulation. Something is using Death Valley as a focal point to tear open dimensional barriers. The collection isn't preparing for a natural convergence. It's being assembled as an army for an invasion. Tom and the other changed rangers suddenly looked uncertain, their synchronized movements faltering. That's impossible. The entity wouldn't lie to us. The entity might not know it's being used, Ellie continued. Think about it. What better way to gather interdimensional scouts than to preserve people who've glimpsed other realities? Someone's been playing a very long game, using Death Valley's unique properties to build a bridge between worlds. The entity's form became more agitated, sand swirling faster. If this is true, the collection is compromised. The patterns the stones have been creating aren't protective. They're summoning. That's when the lights went out. Not just our flashlights, all light, even the bioluminescent glow of the crystals. In the absolute darkness, I heard my grandmother's voice, impossible but unmistakable. Mija, the rocks were never messengers. They were bait. Emergency lighting suddenly activated. Harsh red illumination that revealed we weren't alone anymore. Dozens of figures stood among the crystals, but these weren't preserved bodies. They were something else. Humanoid, but wrong. With too many joints in their limbs and faces that kept shifting between expressions like a glitched video feed. Dimensional refugees, Ellie breathed. They're from collapsed realities, looking for a stable dimension to colonize. The lead figure spoke in a language that hurt to process, words that seemed to exist in multiple tones simultaneously. Tom translated, his voice strained. They thank us for preparing the collection. Each preserved consciousness is a doorway they can use to enter our reality permanently. The sailing stones have been marking the locations where the dimensional membrane is thinnest. In 47 hours, when the solar alignment matches the pattern the rocks have created, they'll complete the transit. 3 million refugees from dying dimensions will pour through Death Valley. 3 million? I looked at the preserved bodies, hundreds of them. How? Each consciousness exists in superposition, the entity explained, its form now defensive, protective of the crystals. They can host thousands of interdimensional refugees simultaneously. We thought we were preserving them. We were actually preparing vessels. The refugees began moving towards the crystals, their forms becoming more solid with each step. Tom and the other changed rangers tried to stop them, but passed right through them. They existed on slightly different dimensional frequencies. We need to destroy the crystals, I said, raising my weapon. No, the entity's voice was desperate. Those are still living people experiencing existence across multiple timelines. Destroying the crystals would collapse their consciousness into a single point. They'd experience every possible death simultaneously. The psychic trauma would ripple through dimensions. Ellie was frantically working with her equipment. There might be another way. The sailing stones, their quantum entangled with the crystals. If we can reverse their movement patterns, make them go backward along their trails, it would undo the summoning pattern, the entity finished. But the stones are 30 miles away on the surface, and we'd need to move all of them simultaneously, precisely, within, it paused, calculating. 17 minutes before the refugees fully phase into our dimension. The German's notebook, I remembered suddenly. They didn't just record where the stones were. They recorded where they'd been. Every position for the past 20 years. Tom's eyes cleared for a moment, his original personality breaking through. The Park Service has GPS trackers on 37 of the major sailing stones. I can access the control system from here, but moving them would require a consciousness that exists across multiple timelines, Ellie finished. Someone in the collection who understands the patterns. She looked at the crystal containing the 49er whose eyes had followed us. Him. He's been watching the patterns for 174 years. The refugee beings sensed our plan. They began moving faster, their forms solidifying. We had minutes, maybe less. Free him, I decided. I'll hold them off. With what? Tom asked. Bullets don't work on interdimensional beings. I pulled out my grandmother's necklace, the one she'd made from uranium ore she'd smuggled out of the mines. It had always felt warm, always seemed to hum with energy. Now, in this chamber where dimensions converged, it blazed with light. She knew, I whispered. She knew this day would come. The uranium in the necklace had been exposed to the original dimensional crack in 1945. It existed partially in multiple realities, making it one of the few things that could affect beings from other dimensions. I held it up, and the refugees recoiled, their forms destabilizing. Ellie and Tom worked frantically to free the 49er using the entity's own energy to carefully dissolve the crystal. As it cracked open, the man, Samuel Hutchings, according to the entity's memory, gasped his first breath in over a century and a half, but when his eyes focused, they held knowledge that spanned timelines. "The stones," he said in a voice like grinding sand. "I've been watching them dance for so long. I know where they need to go, but moving them, it will undo more than just the summoning." Samuel Hutchings stood unsteadily, his body somehow both ancient and timeless. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 17 decades of observation. "Moving the stones backward will collapse the summoning pattern, yes, but it will also undo every death that's been marked by their trails. Every person they've led us to, every body they've marked, those deaths become uncertain, existing in quantum flux. Some will live, some will die differently, some will never have existed at all." "That's impossible," Ellie protested. "You can't just undo death." "In Death Valley, death isn't final," Samuel interrupted. "It's cataloged. The entity has been maintaining a ledger of every ending, creating a database of human termination. The stones are the index system. Reverse them, and you scramble the entire catalog." The interdimensional refugees were pressing closer, my grandmother's uranium necklace the only thing keeping them at bay. But I could feel it growing cooler. Its power wasn't infinite. Do it, I decided. Whatever the consequences, it's better than letting 3 million refugees tear our reality apart. Tom accessed the GPS control system through his connection to the entity. On his tablet, 37 dots appeared on a map of racetrack playa, each representing a tracked sailing stone. "I can trigger their movement remotely, but I need exact coordinates. Samuel, you'll have to guide each one precisely." Samuel closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they showed the depth of someone viewing multiple timelines simultaneously. Stone Alpha 1 needs to return to coordinates 36.6818 degrees north, 117.5643 degrees west. Stone Alpha 2 to 36.6821 degrees north, 117.5639 degrees west. Stone Alpha 3 ... He rattled off coordinates with inhuman precision, each number corresponding not just to a location, but to a specific moment in time when that stone had been there before. Tom input them frantically while Ellie monitored the dimensional stability. "We have a problem," Ellie announced. "The refugees aren't just watching, they're adapting. They're starting to sync with our dimension's frequency. 5 more minutes and the uranium won't affect them anymore." That's when I heard it. Engines, multiple vehicles approaching from above. The ladder shaft filled with voices, and suddenly a tactical team in black gear rappelled into the chamber. Not Park Service, not FBI. Their patches showed an agency I didn't recognize. Dimensional Integrity Commission. Their leader, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, surveyed the scene quickly. "Ranger Yazzie, I'm Director Walsh. We've been monitoring Death Valley since the 1945 incident. Step away from the refugees. You knew?" I was beyond anger, settling into a cold fury. "You knew what was happening here. We've known about the entity, the collection, all of it. Death Valley is one of 17 dimensional soft spots we monitor globally. But this," she gestured at the refugees, "this is new. Someone's weaponized the natural phenomenon." "Someone?" The entity's form swirled, agitated. "Who would do this?" Director Walsh pulled out a device that looked like a militarized IPAD. "Dr. Ernst Hartmann, German scientist, part of Operation Paperclip. He was supposed to have died in 1972, but we've detected his quantum signature at every dimensional soft spot for the past 50 years. He's been setting this up since before most of us were born. The Death Valley Germans, I breathed. Their notebook, it was in German. Hartman's grandchildren, Walsh confirmed. He sent them here in 1996 to plant the final component of his plan. They thought they were exploring, but they were actually delivering a quantum transmitter that would attract refugees from dying dimensions. Ellie looked sick. He's creating a dimensional refugee crisis on purpose. Why? Because in chaos, there's opportunity, a new voice said. From behind the refugees, passing through them like they were mist, walked an elderly man in a pristine lab coat. Despite his apparent age, he moved with unnatural vigor. Dr. Ernst Hartmann had finally shown himself. 17-dimensional soft spots, he continued, his accent still thick after decades in America. Each one preparing to receive refugees from collapsed realities. But not randomly. I've been selecting which dimensions fail, which survivors come here. 3 million of Earth's brightest minds, most advanced warriors, most adaptable survivors. Not an invasion, Director Walsh, an upgrade. You collapsed entire dimensions? The entity's voice carried a fury that made the chamber shake. Dimensions that were failing anyway. Realities where nuclear war had poisoned everything, where climate collapse was irreversible, where humanity had days left at best. I offered them a second chance in a dimension that still has hope. Is that not mercy? It's genocide wrapped in humanitarian language, I spat. Is it? Hartmann approached one of the crystals containing a modern hiker. Ask her. Maria Santos died of heat exhaustion in 2018. In the reality I'm bringing refugees from, she lived. She became a doctor, saved thousands. That version of Maria is among the refugees. Is it wrong to want the better version to survive? Samuel Hutchings laughed. A sound like rocks grinding together. You assume you can control which versions manifest. But I've seen all the timelines, Hartmann. The moment those refugees fully enter our dimension, they don't replace anyone. They overlay. Every person will exist in multiple versions simultaneously. Reality won't upgrade. It'll fragment into infinite shards. A calculated risk, Hartmann said, though for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. No, Samuel continued. A fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness works across dimensions. The collection here, we're stable because the entity maintains us. But 3 million refugees without that stability, they'll create a cascade effect. Every human on Earth will start experiencing all their possible lives simultaneously. Civilization will collapse in hours as people try to process infinite versions of themselves. The tactical team raised their weapons, but Walsh held up her hand. Dr. Hartmann, you're under arrest for crimes against dimensional stability. Hartmann smiled. Arrest me? I exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously now. This is just one iteration of me, and the process has already begun. The stones are moving according to my pattern, not yours. Tom's tablet showed the sailing stone suddenly accelerating, moving in directions that didn't match Samuel's coordinates. They were creating a new pattern, one that looked like a massive spiral with racetrack playa at its center. He's overriding our control, Tom said desperately. No, the entity interjected. The stones were never fully under anyone's control. They respond to the strongest will, the clearest intent. And right now, they're confused, receiving commands from multiple sources. That gave me an idea. What if we didn't try to control them? What if we let them choose? Everyone looked at me like I'd lost my mind. The stones have been moving for centuries before any of us got involved, I explained. They marked bodies, created patterns, but always with purpose. The entity says Death Valley is conscious now, so let it decide. Let the stones move according to the valley's will, not ours or Hartman's. That's insane, Walsh protested. We'd be putting the fate of reality in the hands of a desert that's been successfully preserving human consciousness for 174 years, Ellie countered. One that's shown more wisdom than any of us. The entity's form solidified, becoming more humanoid. The Ranger speaks wisdom. I have been trying to save both the collection and your dimension. But perhaps the answer is to let them merge properly, not through force but through choice. What do you mean? Samuel asked. Every preserved consciousness here chose their fate, either actively or passively. What if we offered the same choice to the refugees? Not invasion, not overlay, but integration. Those who are compatible with existing humans could merge, creating individuals with memories from multiple dimensions but a single consciousness. Those who aren't compatible would be preserved here in the collection until a suitable host is born. Hartman scoffed. Impossible. The refugees are desperate. Dying. They won't wait. They will if the alternative is non-existence, the entity said. It reached out with tendrils of energy, touching each refugee. As it did, their forms stabilized, became less threatening. Communication was established. Through Tom, who was still connected to the entity, we heard their response. They were scientists, artists, soldiers, teachers, people who had watched their worlds die. They didn't want to conquer, they wanted to survive. But Hartman had promised them bodies to inhabit, lives to take over. He lied to you, I said, speaking directly to them through the entity's translation. Taking over our bodies wouldn't save you. It would destroy both of us. But we can offer something else. Partnership. Shared existence. Your knowledge and experience combined with our living bodies. Not replacement, but enhancement. The lead refugee, the one who had first spoken, shifted its form to something more recognizably human. When it spoke, the words came in English. We accept. But the process must be voluntary on both sides. We will not force ourselves on unwilling hosts. Then we need volunteers, Walsh said. 3 million of them. No, Samuel corrected. We need the right matches. The stones, they haven't just been marking deaths, they've been marking compatible consciousness patterns. Every trail they've drawn connects people who could successfully merge across dimensions. I understood suddenly. The patterns aren't random. The stones have been preparing for this for decades, maybe centuries. They knew this day would come. The Shoshone knew, the entity confirmed. They called this valley Timbisha, rock paint, but the full translation is rocks that paint destiny. They understood that the stones were drawing a map not of deaths, but of potential rebirths. Ellie's equipment beeped. The dimensional barrier is critical. We have minutes before it either collapses completely or seals permanently. Whatever we're doing, it has to be now. I looked around the chamber, at the preserved bodies and crystals, the interdimensional refugees, Hartman's smug certainty, Walsh's tactical team, and my friends transformed by the valley's consciousness, everyone waiting for someone else to make the choice. I volunteer, I said. I'll take the first merger. Izzy, no, Ellie started. My grandmother knew this day would come. She prepared me with stories that were actually genetic memories, protected me with uranium that exists between dimensions. I'm already partially connected to multiple realities. Let me be the proof that this can work. The lead refugee approached me. Up close, I could see what it had been. A woman, a park ranger like me, but from a dimension where Yellowstone's supervolcano had erupted in 2012. She had spent her last years trying to save people from the ashfall that blocked out the sun. "Our minds will touch," she warned. "You'll see my dying world. I'll see your living one. We'll share everything, memories, skills, traumas, hopes. I understand." She reached out with a hand that wasn't quite solid, and I met her halfway. The moment we touched, I experienced death and life simultaneously. I saw her world end in fire and ash, felt her desperate struggle to save even one more life. But I also felt her joy at seeing blue sky through my eyes, her relief at breathing air that didn't burn. Our consciousnesses didn't battle for control, they danced, finding harmony and shared purpose. When the merger completed, I was still Isabella Yazzie, but more. I had her knowledge of volcanic geology, her experience with mass evacuation procedures, her memories of a daughter who looked exactly like the one I'd never had. I was myself, but enriched by another lifetime of experience. "It works," I said, my voice carrying new harmonics. "It actually works." The chamber erupted in activity. Other preserved consciousnesses began volunteering, offering to merge with compatible refugees. The sailing stones above ground began moving in a new pattern, not summoning or banishing, but harmonizing, creating a frequency that would allow voluntary merger across the dimensional barrier. But Hartman wasn't done. "Fools! You're diluting humanity, contaminating our pure timeline with failures from dead worlds." He pulled out a device I recognized from my merged memories, a dimensional destabilizer technology from the refugees' world that could collapse pocket realities. "If I can't have my army, no one can." He activated it. The dimensional destabilizer screamed to life, emitting a frequency that made reality itself ripple like water disturbed by an invisible hand. The crystalline structures began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading through their surfaces as the preserved consciousnesses inside cried out in harmonics that human throats couldn't produce. The refugees' forms started to dissolve, their carefully maintained coherence unraveling like smoke in a hurricane. I felt my newly merged consciousness threatening to tear apart. Two sets of memories trying to separate like oil and water. But the entity, Death Valley itself, responded with a roar that came from the very bones of the earth. The chamber filled with sand, not blown by any wind but materialized from every grain that had ever existed in the valley above. Each particle carried a fragment of memory, a 49er's last breath, a German tourist's final realization, a Shoshone elder's death chant from centuries past. The sand swirled around Hartman in patterns that seemed both random and deliberate, forming symbols that existed in no human language but spoke directly to the consciousness. "You understand nothing," the entity spoke through the sandstorm, its voice the combined whispers of millions who had perished in this desert. Death Valley isn't just conscious. It's a collective. Every death here, from the smallest insect baking on hot rocks to the lost pioneers who gave this place its name, becomes part of me. I am their memory, their legacy, their undying will, and I will not let you destroy what we've built through suffering and time. The sand invaded Hartman's destabilizer, each grain carrying trace amounts of quartz and magnetite, minerals that interfered with the device's delicate quantum circuits. But more than that, they carried intention. The collective will of Death Valley's accumulated dead focused on a single purpose: preservation. The device spluttered, sparked, and died, but not before sending out one last desperate pulse that cracked the dimensional barrier like an egg struck by a hammer. Through the crack, we could see them. Not just the 3 million refugees Hartman had gathered, but billions upon billions, every conscious being from every failing dimension, all pressing against the barrier like water against a crumbling dam. I saw versions of Earth where the Cold War had gone hot, where the Black Death had killed 90% instead of 30%, where the dinosaurs had never died and humanity never evolved. Each reality was in its final moments, and every conscious being within them was desperate to escape. "Oh, God," Walsh breathed, her tactical training useless against the scope of what we faced. It's not just a refugee crisis. It's an exodus of infinite proportions. Ellie's equipment was going haywire, displays showing readings that the machines weren't designed to process. The barrier can't hold that many. If they all try to come through at once, both dimensions collapse, Samuel finished, his eyes reflecting the weight of timelines he could see unfolding. Hours from overpopulation of consciousness. Imagine every person suddenly having 1,000 versions of themselves trying to exist in the same space. Theirs from losing their last conscious observers. In quantum mechanics, observation creates reality. Without conscious beings to observe them, those dimensions will simply cease to exist. But something unexpected happened. The sailing stones above, all of them, not just the 37 we tracked with GPS, but hundreds of unmarked rocks that had been moving in secret for centuries, began to move in perfect synchronization. Through Tom's tablet, connected to the park's aerial surveillance system, we watched in awe as their trails formed a pattern visible only from above. It was a message, written simultaneously in English, Spanish, Shoshone, and symbols that seemed to bypass language entirely and speak directly to consciousness. Choose those who choose others. I understood immediately, the merged consciousness of my refugee partner, providing clarity that my single mind couldn't have achieved. It's a selection criterion, not the strongest or smartest, not the richest or most powerful, but those whose primary drive is to save others. The stones are offering to filter the refugees based on their capacity for sacrifice. The entity's form solidified into something almost human, an amalgamation of every person who had ever died in Death Valley, male and female, young and old, native and immigrant, all speaking in perfect unison. The valley has always been about sacrifice. The lost 49ers died so others could find the water holes they marked with their bones. The miners died extracting materials that would power civilization, knowing the radiation would kill them but doing it anyway. The hikers who perished became warnings for others to respect the desert. Every death here has meaning, has saved lives through the lesson of their ending. Let the refugees prove their meaning. Through the crack in dimensions, a test was proposed, not by us, but by reality itself, as if the multiverse had developed its own immune system. Each refugee was presented with a scenario pulled from their own memories. Save themselves immediately by forcing through the barrier, potentially destroying both dimensions, or wait and help others through first, risking their own cessation as their dimension collapsed. The results were heartbreaking and beautiful in equal measure. I watched a mother from a dimension where nuclear winter had begun push her 3 children toward the barrier while her own form began to fade. She smiled as she dissolved, knowing her children would live. A scientist from a reality where gray goo nanotechnology had consumed everything organic spent his last moments transmitting the cure they'd discovered too late, ensuring our dimension wouldn't make the same mistake. Soldiers from a world overrun by something they only referred to as the consuming dark held the line, their weapons useless but their will unbreakable, buying time for civilians to escape. And with each sacrifice, the sailing stones moved, marking not where bodies would be found, but where heroes had chosen others over themselves. The stones carved names into the playa, not in any language, but in patterns that anyone who saw them would understand, meant here, someone chose to save rather than survive. Those who passed the test were matched with compatible hosts from our dimension, not randomly but precisely, based on patterns the stones had been drawing for centuries. Every trail they'd ever made had been part of a vast calculation, determining which consciousnesses could successfully merge. A refugee physicist from a dimension where Einstein had been wrong about relativity merged with Jake Martinez, a park maintenance worker who'd always wondered why he could visualize complex mathematical equations despite never going to college. The merger gave him the knowledge to revolutionize energy production using principles that didn't exist in our physics but worked when combined with our reality's laws. Dr. Patricia Wong, a retired nurse whose arthritis had forced her to stop practicing, merged with a refugee doctor who had spent 30 years fighting a pandemic that had killed 80% of her world's population. The merger not only restored Patricia's youth but gave her medical knowledge centuries ahead of our current understanding. She would go on to cure diseases we hadn't even discovered yet. Each merger was voluntary, balanced, and beneficial to both parties. The original consciousness remained dominant, but enriched by the experiences, knowledge, and perspectives of their dimensional partner. It wasn't replacement or conquest, it was synthesis. But Hartman watched in horror as his carefully orchestrated plan transformed into something he never intended. This isn't evolution, it's contamination. You're destroying the purity of our timeline. Purity. I laughed with two sets of memories, two perspectives on his madness. I'm Navajo Mexican-American, and now I also carry the memories of a Jewish-Korean park ranger from a dimension where the Axis won World War II. She spent her life secretly saving people from camps that never closed, using her position to forge permits and falsify records. There is no purity, Hartman. There never was. There's only survival through diversity, strength through combination, evolution through integration. Walsh's team had surrounded Hartman, weapons drawn, but uncertain what good they would do against someone who claimed to exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. But he was smiling, that terrible smile of someone who thinks they've already won. You think you've won? This is just one of 17 soft spots. My other iterations are— He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in genuine surprise for the first time. Through the dimensional crack, we could see other versions of him in other locations. The Bermuda Triangle, the Dragon's Triangle off Japan, the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, the Hessdalen Valley in Norway. But they were all frozen, surrounded by similar scenes of cooperation between dimensions. The sailing stones of Death Valley had somehow communicated with phenomena at other sites. The moving forests of Romania that walked at night, the singing sands of Egypt that harmonized with the wind, the gravity hills of India where water flowed upward. All had conspired simultaneously to transform his invasion into an integration. The planet itself is conscious, the entity explained, its form rippling with what might have been satisfaction. Has been since July 16, 1945, when the Trinity test cracked not just one barrier, but 17 simultaneously. The energy release was more than nuclear. It was dimensional. Earth has been preparing for this moment ever since, using sites like Death Valley to build a network of consciousness that spans dimensions. We are not 17 separate phenomena. We are one planetary immune system, designed to protect against dimensional infection while allowing beneficial integration. Samuel Hutchings, still viewing all timelines simultaneously despite the strain it placed on his century-and-a-half-old consciousness, added, "The stones weren't just marking deaths or even creating patterns. They were writing code, quantum programming embedded in the mineral structure of the planet itself, instructions that would activate when the dimensions finally touched. Every trail they've drawn, every pattern they've created, every body they led us to, It was all part of a vast algorithm designed to ensure successful integration while preventing dimensional collapse. The mergers continued for hours, though time had become negotiable in the chamber where past, present, and future intersected. The process was beautiful to watch. When compatible pairs found each other, they glowed with a soft light that seemed to come from within. The merger itself looked like a dance, two forms circling each other, growing closer, overlapping, and finally becoming one. The new hybrid consciousness would stand still for a moment, eyes closed, processing the influx of new memories and knowledge, then open their eyes with wonder at seeing the world from multiple perspectives simultaneously. But not everyone chose to merge. Many refugees, especially children who had no adult counterparts, and adults whose counterparts had already died in our dimension, were offered sanctuary in the collection. The crystals reformed around them, but not as prisons, as chrysalises. They would sleep in quantum superposition, experiencing every possible dream simultaneously, until suitable hosts were born or until humanity evolved enough to accommodate them directly. They'll dream of all possible futures, the entity promised, its voice gentle now, almost parental. Every path humanity might take, every choice that could be made, they'll experience them all. And when they wake, whether in a year or a century, it will be to a world ready for them, a world that has grown enough to give them the life they deserve. There were also those who chose neither merger nor preservation. Some refugees, particularly those from dimensions where humanity had evolved beyond physical form, chose to join the entity directly, adding their consciousness to Death Valley's collective. The desert's awareness expanded with each addition, becoming wiser, more complex, more capable of managing the dimensional intersection it had become. As dawn approached, though time had become increasingly subjective in the chamber where dimensions converged, the dimensional barrier began to stabilize. Not sealed as it had been before, not broken as Hartman had intended, but permeable in controlled ways. It had become a membrane rather than a wall, allowing controlled exchange between dimensions. "We'll need to establish protocols," Walsh said, already thinking ahead to the bureaucratic nightmare this would create. Immigration policies for dimensional refugees, health screenings for consciousness mergers, security measures to prevent another Hartman. "It won't be your decision alone," the entity interrupted. "Death Valley is now an embassy, neutral territory between dimensions. The preserved consciousnesses in the collection, the merged beings, the dimensional refugees, and the original humans will all have a voice in how this proceeds." Hartman, defeated and surrounded, made one last desperate play. From his coat he pulled out a small device no bigger than a car key, a personal dimensional shifter that he'd kept as an escape route. "If I can't control this dimension, I'll find another. There are infinite realities. In one of them, my plan succeeded. In one of them, I'm the hero who saved humanity from contamination." He pressed the activation button, but nothing happened. Or rather, something did happen, but not what he expected. Every version of him from every dimension, all 17 iterations he'd placed at soft spots around the globe, was pulled into our reality simultaneously. They materialized in the chamber, 17 Hartmans of various ages and conditions. One was missing an arm, lost to something he'd awakened in the Bermuda Triangle. Another was partially crystallized, transformed by the singing sands of Egypt. A third was younger, from a dimension where he'd started his plan decades earlier. They looked at each other in horror, each recognizing their own obsession reflected 17 times over. "Poetic justice," Walsh commented. "You wanted to overlay consciousnesses? Experience it yourself." The Hartmans tried to speak, but their voices overlapped into incomprehensibility. They reached for each other. Whether to fight or embrace, we couldn't tell, and the moment they touched, they began to merge involuntarily. But unlike the careful, voluntary mergers we'd facilitated, this was chaos. Every version fighting for control, every timeline battling for supremacy, 17 different plans trying to execute simultaneously. When it ended, what stood there was still recognizably Hartman, but fractured, jumping between versions of himself every few seconds, unable to maintain a single identity. Young, then old, whole, then damaged, speaking in 17 languages, including some from dimensions where German had evolved differently. His eyes showed the strain of experiencing 17 lifetimes simultaneously without the buffer of acceptance that made the voluntary mergers bearable. "The stones will mark your position," the entity told him, not unkindly, but with the finality of judgment. "All your positions, across all timelines, simultaneously. You'll exist everywhere and nowhere, conscious but incoherent, experiencing every version of your plan failing in real time. This is what you would have done to humanity: forced merger without consent, consciousness without coherence." Walsh's team took the fractured Hartman into custody, though custody seemed inadequate for someone who existed in quantum flux. They would take him to a facility designed to handle dimensional anomalies, though I suspected he would serve more as a warning than a prisoner, a living example of what happened when someone tried to force evolution rather than allowing it to occur naturally. As we prepared to leave the chamber, Ellie took final readings, her equipment finally able to process the new dimensional constants. "The dimensional barrier is stable but fundamentally changed. We're not isolated anymore. Earth has become a junction point, a natural meeting place where dimensions can safely intersect. It's like we've become the grand central station of the multiverse. A refugee camp for dying realities," Walsh added, her tone suggesting she wasn't entirely happy with this development. "A hospital," I corrected, feeling my merged partner's agreement resonating through our shared consciousness. "Where wounded dimensions come to heal, to share their knowledge before they fade. We're not taking refugees, we're inheriting the legacy of entire universes. Every dimension that touches ours leaves behind its discoveries, its art, its solutions to problems we haven't even encountered yet." "And its problems," Walsh countered. "Yes," the entity agreed. "But problems shared across dimensions often have solutions that single realities could never discover alone." We climbed back to the surface, the latter feeling both endless and instant as we passed through layers of geological time that now also represented layers of dimensional space. When we emerged, Racetrack Playa had transformed completely. The sailing stones had arranged themselves in a perfect spiral, their trails glowing faintly with a phosphorescence that had nothing to do with any mineral known to our original Earth. At the center, where the hatch had been, stood a monument that hadn't been there before, a crystal formation that seemed to be grown rather than built, showing different images depending on your angle of view and, we would later discover, which dimension you originally came from. From one angle, I saw the lost 49ers finding water, their death march becoming a life path for others. From another, the Death Valley Germans discovering the chamber, their disappearance becoming a doorway for understanding. From a third angle, billions of refugees making the choice to save others rather than themselves, transformation through sacrifice. "The collection will continue," the entity spoke through the desert wind, its voice now carrying harmonics from the thousands of refugees who had chosen to join it, rather than merge with human hosts. "But now, it's not just preserving the dead, it's nurturing the future. Every person who dies in Death Valley now has a choice: fade into peace, join the collective consciousness, wait in superposition for a compatible refugee to merge with, or something new, become an ambassador, existing partially in multiple dimensions to help others navigate the transition. Over the following weeks, the world changed in ways no one could have predicted. The mergers had brought knowledge from dimensions where different technologies had developed. Climate change was addressed with atmospheric processors from a dimension where humanity had faced it in the 1960s. Cancer was cured using biological techniques from a reality where evolution had taken a different path. Mental illness was treated with therapies that addressed consciousness itself, rather than just brain chemistry. But it wasn't utopian. Many people rejected the mergers, forming pure human settlements in areas far from dimensional soft spots. Others struggled with merged consciousness, requiring entirely new forms of therapy. Some refugees couldn't find compatible hosts and chose preservation, leading to vast crystalline gardens beneath Death Valley where thousands dreamed of futures yet to come. And the sailing stones kept moving, now marking not just deaths but potential mergers, future connections, dimensional weak points that needed monitoring. I returned to my ranger duties, but everything was different. My daily reports now included dimensional stability readings alongside weather conditions. When I gave tours, I explained not just the geology of Death Valley but its role as an interdimensional sanctuary. Visitors came not just to see the moving rocks, but to volunteer for mergers, to offer sanctuary to refugees, or simply to stand where dimensions touched and feel the vastness of existence. The racetrack playa became a pilgrimage site. People would follow the sailing stones trails, finding messages meant specifically for them, coordinates where their dimensional doubles had died, invitations to merge with specific refugees, or simply encouragement written in minerals that glowed with impossible colors. The stones had become intermediaries, translating between dimensions in ways that conscious beings couldn't always achieve. My grandmother visited me in dreams sometimes, or maybe it was her refugee counterpart from a dimension where uranium mining had never happened, and she'd lived to 103. She smiled and said, "The rocks were never just messengers, Mija. They were teachers, showing us that nothing truly dies, it just transforms. Death Valley doesn't collect endings. It collects beginnings waiting to happen. Every grave is a garden, every ending a doorway." A year after the convergence, as historians were already calling it, I stood at Racetrack Playa with Ellie. We'd both merged with multiple refugees by then. She carried the memories of 3 different versions of herself, each brilliant in different ways, while I had integrated with 2 more rangers from dimensions where Death Valley had different names, but the same purpose. "Do you regret it?" Ellie asked, her voice carrying harmonics from 3 different dimensions, each slightly out of phase, in a way that created an oddly beautiful chord. "Opening that hatch? Starting all of this?" I thought about the question, consulting not just my own feelings but those of my merged partners. One had lived through the nuclear winter of her dimension, watching everyone she loved die slowly of radiation poisoning. Another had seen Earth consumed by gray goo, spending her last days desperately transmitting warnings through dimensional static. Both were grateful to exist here, to have their knowledge and experience mean something. "The stones would have revealed it eventually," I said. "They've been preparing for this for centuries, maybe longer." Every trail they've ever drawn was part of the equation. We just happened to be the generation that got to see the pattern complete. The question isn't whether we should have opened the door, it's whether we're worthy of what came through. A new stone began to move as we watched, a small one we hadn't cataloged before. It traced a simple message in the cracked earth, but in a language that didn't exist until the merger, a combination of English, quantum mathematics, and emotional harmonics that could only be read by those who had experienced multiple dimensions. Continue. We would. The collection would grow, the mergers would continue, and Death Valley would remain what it had always been, a place where endings became beginnings, where death became transformation, where the impossible became everyday reality. But now, it was also something more. A library of extinct dimensions, a hospital for wounded realities, a nursery for hybrid consciousnesses that would inherit not just Earth, but the legacy of countless Earths. The sailing stones still move at Racetrack Playa, their trails visible from space, creating patterns that can be seen from other dimensions. They mark where bodies are buried, yes, but more importantly, they mark where souls are reborn, where dimensions meet, where humanity evolves not through force, but through choice. They write the history of the future in the minerals of the past, teaching us that death is just another kind of transformation, that consciousness is bigger than any single reality, that the desert knows more than it should because it remembers everything and everyone who ever crossed its surface. If you visit Death Valley now, you might see them. The sailing stones creating their patterns, writing messages and languages from dead dimensions. You might feel the presence of the collection beneath your feet. Thousands of consciousnesses dreaming in crystal chambers, experiencing every possible future simultaneously. You might even meet a ranger like me, carrying memories from multiple dimensions, eyes that have seen worlds die and be reborn, voice carrying harmonics from realities that no longer exist, except in our merged consciousness. The rocks know where the bodies are. But more importantly, they know where the bodies are going. Forward, into a future where death is just another kind of transformation, where every ending is a potential beginning, where the desert itself guards the doorway between worlds. Welcome to Death Valley, where the temperature still hits 134 degrees Fahrenheit, where the elevation still drops below sea level, where the rocks still sail across ancient lake beds. But now it's also where dimensions touch, where consciousnesses merge, where humanity learns what it means to be more than singular. Come for the geology. Stay for the interdimensional evolution. Just remember, if the rocks start moving toward you, they might be trying to tell you something. Listen carefully. Your dimensional double might be waiting to share their story, their knowledge, their final gift from a dying universe. The stones are still moving. They're still marking positions. And if you know how to read their trails, they'll show you not just where the bodies are, but where the future is being written, one transformed soul at a time. This is Ranger Isabella Yazzie, speaking from Death Valley National Park, California, Earth, Dimension Prime, Junction Point Alpha, Convergence Year 1. If you're hearing this from another dimension, know that you're welcome here. The rocks have already drawn your trail. We're waiting for you.